Hello and welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast and YouTube show for SQL Server developers and database administrators. I'm Kendra Little from SQLWorkbooks.com. Today, I'm going to talk about what people love and what people hate about SQL Server Management Studio. I'm not going to get super technical today. I'm just going to dish a little bit about Management Studio and why people feel really strongly about it. The question that inspired this episode is, I was giving a webcast on tips and tricks for using Management Studio, and one of the very first questions that came in before the webcast even started was, why does Management Studio crash so much? And I've had Management Studio crash on me plenty of times in the past too. People love that SQL Server Management Studio is so configurable, and the tips and trips webcast that I gave, it's a lot of all of these ways you can set up Management Studio to get things like you want them to be, and also to do some things that it might not be obvious that you can even do them in a faster way. But one of the reasons that people also really can dislike Management Studio is that they find it really confusing. And this is related. Like, people have really strong feelings about Management Studio because there's a pretty strong learning curve. There's just a ton of things that you can do in SQL Server Management Studio, and it's very, very highly configurable, but to a level that actually makes it pretty confusing. Sometimes I get into a situation myself where, I've been using this thing for many, many years since it came out with SQL Server 2005. Back in the day, I remember when Management Studio first came out, I was like, I don't know if I like this thing, really comfortable with the old tools. But, sometimes there will be a setting that I'm looking for, and just finding it can be pretty tricky. There's even a little find bar in the settings where you can search for a given setting in Tools Options when you're going into the different things you can configure. And sometimes that find bar doesn't even find me what I'm looking for. So to make the best of this, what I do and what a lot of people do is I have a setup checklist for SQL Server Management Studio that I like to use so that when I'm configuring Management Studio, I have a list I can actually run of these are the things that gives me what I want Management Studio to do for my preferences. Because preferences do differ, having this setup list also can help you just remember what you like about Management Studio that it doesn't do by default. I have worked in different situations, and I've had situations where, as a consultant, I'm not just connecting to things always from my version of Management Studio. I'm looking remotely at someone else's computer and I'm using their Management Studio setup. And it's not always cool to just change someone's setup, but having these setup checklists, not only, even if I'm not going to run through it, knowing what's on my list of things that I change kind of sets me up to, expect, okay, it's these, I know the items that aren't going to be normal to me because they are the things that I typically change. So I can tell, for instance, okay, I'm using someone else's setup of Management Studio. If I script out indexes and the indexes are compressed, it's not going to script out the data compression settings because that's not configured by default. So I know what to look for if I'm going to do certain things. It's not going to do that unless that person has configured it as well. One of the other things that people love about Management Studio, and I love this too, is that there's a lot of shortcuts, and you can configure a lot of your own shortcuts so that you don't have to reach for the mouse super often. You can keep your hands on the keyboard in Management Studio, and that's great. And when you're sort of in the flow and you're using a lot of the keyboard shortcuts, it just feels, really cool. It feels really good. There's something about that flow of being able to do a lot of things on the keyboard that is just fun, but there's also the fact that it's hard to remember all of these shortcuts. Even shortcuts, that you know pretty well, if you don't use them for a while and then you go back to it, you're like, oh wait, how did I do that thing again? The muscle memory is gone. To learn shortcuts, what I like to do is just practice them in small groups. I found that I don't do super well learning lots of shortcuts at once. Instead, I like to have a list of them, and I put this together with my setup checklist. I have a free course on Management Studio tips and tricks, and I not only have the list of things I like to configure, but I keep lists of shortcuts there too, because I like to periodically review them and practice using them, because even shortcuts that I kind of know, if I'm not in the habit of actually using them, then I don't actually use them. So I'll periodically look through the list and be like, oh yeah, I should get back to using this shortcut on the keyboard to get me down to the results pane so that I don't just grab the mouse every time I want to go down to the results pane for entrant, for example. But my favorite shortcuts these days are using the little IDE that you can use to switch between sessions. If you do Control-Tab, it brings up this little display, and hitting Control-Tab iterates you through all of your Management Studio sessions, and you can easily switch between what you've got open. If you do Alt F7, that brings up the same IDE, but lets you switch over to Object Explorer and things like that, and you can actually arrow around when you bring it up with Alt F7. If say you are on Object Explorer and then you want to switch back to a session. So Alt F7 is really flexible too. I don't love it because on some keyboards I have to hit a function key to hit, I have to hit Fn to be able to use a function key. So Control-Tab works on more of my keyboards and is easier, and I can't get enough of that switching between sessions. It's a lot like the Windows Alt-Tab, but within Management Studio for your sessions. People also love just the flexibility of Management Studio. It does so many things. And when you think about all of the different things, there's a wizard you can open that scripts out all the objects in the database. There's security you can configure. There's objects you can create. There's just so many little tools in Management Studio, and it's even getting bigger. Right now we have an extended events GUI within Management Studio. Whereas ye old SQL profiler, there used to be a shortcut to it. There still is. You can open it from Management Studio, but it's its own application, right? So Management Studio is getting more and more integrated as this giant Swiss Army knife, but there's always things that people dislike that it's missing. The one thing I've found, though, is that certain things that I thought Management Studio didn't do are in there. I just didn't know how to get to them. And a lot of these, for example, the scripting options I was talking about. I thought for a long time that Management Studio just wouldn't script out, if you're scripting a partition index, that it just wouldn't script out the file group that it'll be on. I think that's one of the things, or the partition scheme that it's created on. But that's actually like the compression settings. That's one of the options there's a whole series of settings for how things get scripted out under tools, options. There's a whole scripting setting for Object Explorer. I just didn't know it existed. I didn't find out that it existed until I sort of tweeted about this. Is this a bug that it doesn't do X? And Adam Mechanic answered me oh, it does. It's under, here it is. And lo and behold, the things that I thought were missing were actually there. But if you do have things where you're I really think it should do this differently, you can file a suggestion or a bug at connect.microsoft.com. One of the ones that I've seen recently is when you drag over all the table name, or you drag over the columns folder, in Object Explorer, you can grab the column folder for a table and drag that column folder over, and it will auto-populate the names of all of the columns in a comma-delimited list in your session. But it doesn't put the square brackets around the column names. If you drag over the table name, it will put safety brackets around the table name so that if you have any weird characters in there, everything still works. So there's like an inconsistency between what you drag over from Object Explorer to your window. And someone filed, I can't remember if it was a bug or a suggestion, but basically make it consistent. And the developer looked at this and was like, oh yeah, we can totally fix that. And I believe that the fix hasn't been released yet, but the bug is in the completed state, but I don't think that release of Management Studio is coming out. Now I can't remember. I'm like, did that happen the last time I tested it? But it actually got things changed and got things fixed. And that's one of the cool things, is if you want it to be different, okay, first of all, ask on Twitter and see, is it actually there and I just don't know about it. But Microsoft is open to knowing, what do you want this thing to do and how can we do things better? And your change could become reality. I really love how active the Management Studio coding team has become. And Management Studio, it used to be that we only got updates of it when SQL Server got updated. But now Management Studio gets releases on its own. And this is fantastic because they can release as often as they're ready to release. And when we update Management Studio, we can choose, do we want to update it on the production server at all, or do we just want to update it on our client machines now and maybe update Management Studio more quickly on our client machines than we would on the production server itself, where we may not want to reboot every time we just have an update to Management Studio. There are still folks who are afraid to upgrade for a variety of reasons. If I'm running a new version of Management Studio, is everything going to work? And this is valid because, like with any software, when things change, sometimes things break. So there was a recent version of Management Studio where if you were connecting to a case-sensitive instance, there were certain graphical elements that didn't work as they had before. But the good news is you can choose how you update Management Studio in the sense of how many versions of Management Studio you have. And this is particularly with major versions of Management Studio. We recently had just a big major version. Management Studio lets you do side-by-side installations. So you can do things like say, okay, I'm going to try out the new version on my client computer, but if anything's weird, I can, run a version on a different machine that's older. But you can also install side-by-side on your computer, latest and greatest, and then keep there, if you want to go back even the last major version of, I'm going to just keep this last major version of it around because, it doesn't have the new look and feel, and it doesn't have some of the cool things in the new version, but for accomplishing basic tasks, it's my old faithful. You can keep that old version around for a really long time. And that lets you say, okay, I'm only going to use the new updated SSMS against our dev instances. I still have my older version to use against production. You can be as careful as you want to be, which I think is terrific, and always, 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 test against development and update on your workstation before you ever go and touch things on the production server. One of the things that I can't get enough of is that lots of people in the community document things. They create their checklists for, here's the things I changed in SSMS. And they also mention and create presentations for their favorite shortcuts and their tips and tricks. And I can't get enough of those sessions. I would watch one a week or maybe even more often if there were a ton of them out there. On the other hand, there is a lot of community participation because it's so complicated. And there may be times where something you see in a presentation, you try to do it and it doesn't work for you. And maybe that's because you're connected through a VM and something's overwriting a key in the shortcut you're trying to use. Or maybe it's for another reason. Let's get back to this original question. The original question that sort of inspired me to put this together was, well, why does my Management Studio crash so much? And this is kind of similar to, why doesn't X feature work for me in Management Studio? One of the first things to just check is, What version of Management Studio are you running and how old is it? Because you may be hitting a bug in an older version of Management Studio. It might be a bug that causes it to crash, or it might be a bug where just something didn't work. So for example, one of my favorite shortcuts is Control-U. It takes you up to the Use Database box. And I've had some folks be like, it just doesn't work for me. Well, there was a bug in an older version of Management Studio that Control-U didn't work. So for some of these folks, updating Management Studio fixed it. Some of the crashing bugs are from older versions as well. Also, are you using a plugin or are you connecting in a way like with a virtual machine that could be causing the problem? Some of the cases I've had where Control-U wasn't working for people was actually caused by the fact that they were using a plugin that had broken Control-U as well. So you've got to sort of test out, okay, what do I have installed that isn't for Microsoft that's like extra in here, and could it be causing the problem as well? Sometimes it might be also that, of course, your virtual machine provider thinks that keyboard shortcut really means something else too. If you are seeing repeated crashing and it isn't any of these things, have you reported it to Microsoft? Because you should report it to Microsoft. If Management Studio is crashing all of the time, they don't want that to happen. So sites.connect.microsoft.com, if you're getting a specific error message, or if the crash is happening when you do a given sequence of tasks, you can let the developers know about that as well. So do something about it if you're kind of tracking it down and you've just hit an issue in Management Studio. And please, 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 please share the things that you love doing in Management Studio and the tips and tricks that you have that make using it easier and more fun. Because like I said, I really can't get enough of that stuff. I would love to have even more shortcut cheat sheets be out there and even more checklists of here's how to get more out of your day with Management Studio, because like you, I spend an awful lot of time in Management Studio, and the more fun I have, the more fun my day is. Thanks for joining me for Dear SQL DBA this week. I'm Kendra Little, and I'll see you again soon.